Hello, my name is Daniel Beer. I'm a senior lecturer in modern European history at Royal Holloway, and my area of expertise is modern Russia. So I teach classes, I teach seminars, give lectures on Russia from basically the beginning of the 19th century through to the end of the 20th. And if you come to Royal Holloway on this taste today, I'm going to be giving a lecture and running seminars on Russia in this crucial 100 years that separates the defeat of the Russian Empire in the Crimean War in 1856 all the way through to the ousting of Nikita Khrushchev as General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1964. And the way I'm going to approach this in the lectures and in the seminars will be to concentrate on a series of turning points. One, of course, is obviously defeat in Crimea, something which exposes Russia for what contemporaries saw as a kind of a colossus with clay feet. That in a way Russia's victory over Napoleon had created an illusion of strength, which was then rudely exposed by the modern industrialized Western powers of Britain and France, which pulverized Russia's armies in Crimea. That then leads to the next great turning point, the great reforms of the 1860s. So an attempt, as Alexander II says, to institute reform from above before it institutes itself from below. So we'll think about what those reforms meant, what kinds of contradictions they introduced into the system. Russia also embarks upon a campaign of industrialization in the 1870s and 1880s, something which is designed to enable the regime to field modern mechanized armies capable of competing with Russia's great power rivals. The assassination of Alexander II in 1881 is obviously a major turning point. The reform agenda grinds to a sudden halt, and Alexander's successors, Alexander III and Nicholas II, essentially set their faces against any further change. So there is this increasing pressure building within the system, which, if we think about it as Karl Marx might have done, the base, Russia's economy and its society, increasingly are in conflict with its own political structure. 1905, what Trotsky famously calls the dress rehearsal, the first Russian Revolution, is something which radicalizes Russian society against the autocracy. So the autocracy manages to claw back authority through a sustained and bloody campaign of internal repression. It manages to defeat the revolution by force of arms, but certainly not by force of argument. And the regime, essentially, even before it enters World War I, has had much of its moral authority shredded over the previous decade. The First World War can, I think, be thought about as essentially a revolutionary war which lasts for a full 7 years. So beginning in 1914, and peace in Russia is not meaningfully achieved until the bloody conclusion of the Civil War at the end of 1920. So this conflict is one which eviscerates the foundations of the Russian autocracy. There is complete moral collapse in the elite, and it gives birth to a new radical regime which in many respects picks up the torch of modernization from the imperial government, but sees that modernization in radically different terms. So the Bolshevik Party are committed to a radical overhaul of the lands of the former Tsarist Empire in accordance with theories drawn from Karl Marx. But they crucially see violence, they see mass mobilization, the limitless expansion of state intervention, state propaganda, as entirely legitimate instruments to bring about a new society. After a period of messy compromise with the forces of capitalism in the 1920s, the regime goes on the offensive once again at the end of the 1920s in the twinned campaigns of collectivization and industrialization. And I want to argue in my lecture that in a sense this can be seen as the real Russian Revolution. So it's in this period of the end of the 1920s, beginning of the 1930s, that we see the emergence of a society radically different from its predecessors, and one which ultimately will last until the regime's collapse at the end of the 1980s. What contemporaries call the revolution from above, or the great breakthrough, in many ways is a revolution of the same stature. It's a turning point as significant as 1917. I'll also talk about the effects of the Second World War, how this was an apocalyptic conflict for which essentially the Bolsheviks were ideologically prepared, but that it detonated a whole series of messy internal civil wars across the territory of the Soviet Union, which still today actually inform much of the politics and the conflicting national identities of Eastern and Central Europe. And lastly, I'll talk about Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech and his attempts to manage this Stalinist past and essentially to sort of refurbish the moral authority of the regime by allowing a kind of controlled level of dissent, a controlled level of criticism of the past, but a level of criticism which was to be focused explicitly on the crimes of the dictator, but was at the same time intended ultimately to shore up the moral authority of the Bolshevik Party and of the entire revolutionary project. And I'll talk a bit about how the dangers of that controlled level of dissent suddenly escaping the designs of its architect, in some sense foreshadows what we see then in the 1980s under Mikhail Gorbachev.